Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us right now. We're just going to give it a few minutes as people start to join the webinar. Thank you. All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening again from wherever you're joining us. My name is Chris Shama, and I'm with the CALP Network. I'm very happy to launch the first of a 3-webinar series on humanitarian cash and COVID-19, specifically on digitalization and remote programming. Before we kickstart with this exciting webinar, we're just going to go through a few housekeeping rules. Again, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, where you're from, where you're logging on, and who do you work with. And yeah, so this event is going to last approximately 90 minutes. Our team is now going to drop the link for the Twitter handle that we're going to be using throughout the webinar. So feel free to engage with the conversation that's happening on Twitter, share your thoughts, your key takeaways, and reflections. There is a Q&A box at the bottom for you to drop your questions in there. Please do not put the questions in the chat because we might miss them and we don't want to do that. For this event, all of your mics are muted. So again, please use the chat or the Q&A box as needed. This event will be recorded and is going to be shared online for anyone that wants to see this, but were unable to join us today. And last but not least, in case of a Zoom hacker, staff will remove and block the offender from all future events. Now, without further ado, let's kick off the webinar. So I'm going to just introduce the panel very quickly. Anna was meant to join us, but is unable to do so due to connectivity issues where she's currently at. Unfortunately, so I'm going to hand over to Barnaby Wilkes-King from GSMA to quickly introduce himself. Over to you, Barnaby.
Thanks, Chris, and hi, everyone. Great to be here. My name's Barnaby, and I'm the Director of Research and Policy at GSMA's Mobile for Humanitarian Innovation Programme. For those of you that don't know us, GSMA is the trade association of the mobile industry globally, and the Mobile for Humanitarian Programme is part of the non-profit activities which the UK government funds to improve responsible access and use of digital mobile-enabled technology in humanitarian crises. So we look at things like government regulation around SIM registration for refugees, building partnerships between mobile operators and humanitarian agencies. So lots and lots on mobile money and its use. We also have an innovation fund to develop new ideas. So really excited to be part of this conversation and share some of our insights from the mobile industry. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Barnaby. Next up, we have Alex Nawar from Give Directly. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. Really glad to be here today. My name is Alex Nawar. I'm a regional director at Give Directly. Give Directly is an international NGO that focuses on providing unconditional cash transfers to people living in poverty and people experiencing crises. And as regional director, I oversee our work in the US as well as in our humanitarian programs. I've been with Give Directly about 3 years.
Thanks, Alex. Next up, we have Jenny Weatherworld from CRS. Over to you.
Thanks, Chris, and hi, everyone. Also very excited to be with you all here today. My name's Jenny, and I'm a Global Cash and Markets Technical Advisor for Catholic Relief Services, or CRS, sitting on the Global Humanitarian team. So I've been working on various cash programs for the last 10 years, and my current role includes providing technical support to our cash programs across Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia. And CRS is kind of an implementing agency, and we've implemented a significant amount of cash and voucher assistance globally, particularly during the COVID pandemic. We transferred almost $120 million of CVA assistance during the pandemic. So I'm hoping to bring some experience from an operational agency that's implementing cash to the discussion today, and a few examples from the field.
Thanks, Jenny, and lovely to have you with us. Last but not least, Simon Reed from IrisGuard. Over to you. Simon, I believe you're on mute. So sorry.
Hi, sorry about that. Hi, my name's Simon Reed. I'm the Deputy Director of Irisguard. We have personally, I have a long background in the mobile sector, working with smart cards and SIMs and some of the very first mobile wallet schemes implemented, like M-Pesa. My role with Irisguard is as the Deputy Director to look at the strategy and the development of the company. So I've got both a strategic and a technical background. And what we wanted to really reflect here is we're from the private sector, we're members of CALP for the last 2 years or so, is our operational experience. We've currently managed systems for the UNHCR, WFP, and around about 43 other NGOs, of which CRS is also one of part of that as well, and utilizing a range of different FSP linked technologies based upon using the iris as the anchor biometric. And we've moved around about $1.2 billion of value, that's both cash and assistance, through our systems with our humanitarian partners over the past year. And I wanted to share some experiences that we've specifically had on COVID and how we've adapted our schemes to be able to continue to actually, almost without any interruption, deliver the services to a large number of refugees. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. And I can't wait to unpack a bit more of what you have been working on in a few. So this is our panel for today. A very exciting group of individuals that have a lot of experience. So now let's just kind of talk a bit about why we're having this conversation today. So earlier in 2021, CALP developed a crowdsourced paper reflecting on how CVA functioned within COVID-19 within the first year, which was later published on ODI's Disasters Journal, which you can also find there and download if you haven't read it yet. And so moving forwards and kind of taking this kind of pause to reflect on 2 years into the pandemic, what are our reflections on the initial findings? Where are we now? What are things that we're taking with us based on the adaptations that have been picked up? And how will they impact our future operations and ways of doing things? So kind of jumping off of there, it's really important to kind of reflect on some of the key findings from the paper. Rose, next slide, please. So some of the key findings from the paper include that digital tools were used to facilitate remote CVA programming. And with that facilitation and kind of expanding not only operations, but considering new target groups and whatnot, adaptations and innovations had to come through, and also kind of reflecting on the partnerships that we have pre-existing or looking into new partnerships, adapting and rolling out additional support through the pandemic. So this also kind of reflected on regulatory shifts and fee reductions to encourage the uptake of digital payments, for example. And another key finding included the fact that digital tools and systems were kind of enablers to ensure faster and bigger responses. But with that, actually, a lot has been highlighted on the risks of the digital divide, which we'll kind of talk about a bit. And definitely with all of this, the issues of data responsibility and data risks were definitely we're focused on a lot more. So looking at today and kind of kicking off our discussion with the panelists, digital adaptations definitely has come to mind. And CVA being a modality that not only met the restrictions on movement and social distancing, which COVID-19 has put us under, it also enabled us to deliver remotely in many locations using digital tools. So kind of building off of that and kind of reflecting on what were the important aspects and adaptations of digital CVA programming tools during the pandemic? What has been retained and what has changed within CVA program design? I think I'm going to kick off with Jenny with the first question in terms of, from your experience, what are the organizational examples that you can share, including what worked well and what didn't work so well through the work that you did as CRS?
Great, thanks, Chris. Absolutely. I'm thinking of a couple of examples. So maybe let me start with our Gaza program. So in Gaza, the CRS team and our partners had been implementing e-voucher and cash programs for a number of years. And the first main adaptation during the pandemic was linked to the delivery mechanism for CVA. So pre-pandemic, the main delivery mechanism was based on participants receiving like a physical card that was topped up with assistance that could then be used in vendor shops to buy goods or get cash back from vendors. And due to lockdowns and risks associated with gathering people, it wasn't possible to organize these physical card distributions. So the team negotiated with the financial service provider managing the platform to instead send a unique PIN code to the participant's mobile number. And that code functioned in the same way as a digital wallet. So instead of presenting a physical card to purchase items, they presented the code along with their ID to transact at the vendors. And we also arranged to have our participating vendors offer a delivery service for high-risk groups and people that were like self-isolating or had COVID. So I think one key learning was that we found this model of using a local vendor network to provide cash delivery enabled us to continue our programming even when bank services were disrupted. So many of you may know that in Gaza, another common delivery mechanism for cash is like over the counter in bank branches. But during lockdowns, we found that these services were heavily disrupted, particularly when there were restrictions on the number of people that could come to the branch or on their, operating hours. And then I think a second adaptation was around how we did our targeting and verification of participants to receive cash assistance. So in Gaza, the Ministry of Social Development was tracking with different sources like the Ministry of Labour, different NGOs, unions, the Chamber of Commerce, which families had lost their sources of income or livelihoods as a result of the pandemic. So instead of doing our own targeting process from scratch, CRS and our partners relied on receiving these lists from the ministry for initial targeting of assistance in response to COVID. And where we'd previously relied on in-person verification through household visits, the team reverted to doing this via phone calls instead. And where we'd normally deliver our orientation messages in person, gathering people together, we did that over the phone to explain the amount of assistance people would get, how the delivery mechanism worked. And although we've reintroduced some in-person field visits for verification since the pandemic, we've largely kept these kind of remote communication options with beneficiaries. And I think maybe just one last thing to say that actually making these adaptations during the pandemic meant the team was able to mount a rapid cash response during the initial days of the May 2021 conflict escalation prior to the ceasefire being agreed. So this time it was like the security situation that meant the team needed to rely on remote programming methods in order to reach people quickly. So using remote phone-based verification, communication of messages via phone, sending the transaction code via SMS instead of a physical card, enabled the team to quickly scale to reach conflict-affected families while the conflict was still active. So I think like having that pre-investment during the pandemic to figure out these remote procedures really helped the team be more responsive, like for the next emergency, which was more conflict related.
That's incredible. I mean, I'm hearing about preparedness. I'm hearing about considering new partnerships. I'm hearing about kind of shifting the way we do everything, and it working just as well, of course, with its own challenges. But I think I want to pick up on the financial service provider engagement. And I turn to you, Simon. As a service provider working with the humanitarian organizations, what would you highlight as key features of the interventions you supported as part of the pandemic response?
Great, and I think it segues quite nicely into what Jenny's highlighted as well. I mean, we've been working with the UNHCR for over 8 years. This is the 9th year now, under a framework contract, which actually is one key point that I wanted to sort of point out, that started for registration, and we utilized the iris as part of the biometric identification management system that UNHCR and WFP, UNICEF, and around about 40 other NGO members actually hook into to utilize. They have their own databases, but they can use that obviously for the proper definition that we all know for refugees. We also have a deployment with UNRWA as well in Palestine, which also crosses over with what's happening in Gaza and some of the other areas. So our experience is very much about the challenging environment already. And I guess that's my point, that we haven't, deployed our systems as the, and interestingly, of course, the iris, which is the anchor, one of the anchor biometrics, of course, is already touch free. You don't need to actually have anything physically with you. You're already distanced. You can be wearing a mask as well. So actually, in terms of our operational usage, it was zero difference for COVID. What it did do was it added another level. And in 2019, which is partly my background very much as well, we introduced the mobile, so an iris camera on a mobile device. And there's only a couple of companies in the world have done that. We did that to extend the reach. And I guess it comes back to the point that we have contracts that back to back for authentication. And that means that we have to deploy a variety of different FSPs, not just one FSP. So to go back to Jenny's point about we have banks, but we also have on ATMs. So if the bank is closed, then actually, just to highlight her point, you can go outside and still receive. And refugees, and we have, in the Syrian crisis particularly, we're still supporting, 2.5 million plus another 4 million that are dispersed as well. So that's a large number of people on a regular daily basis as well. So ATMs came out extremely there. People always go, you put iris cameras on ATMs. Oh, it's a bit weird. It's a bit futuristic, etc. Actually working perfectly under this conditions as well. Also deployed in mobile vans as well. But I think that's the main point I want to say is we also have a long-standing cooperation with Zain. Zain Cash has a big wallet system. Zain are very big in the Middle East and African region, which is where we predominantly support. And that was to allow effectively a couple of things. One was to verify the wallet. So that was to put an anchor verification on the wallet so that monies could actually be transferred from the agency through the wallet as well. So again, this is where Barnaby, I'm sure, will expand a little bit more on the usage of mobile wallets from when we first started to do these. I mean, they've really driven economic power, but also connectivity in some interesting ways. But that meant that previous to this, people would come along to one of the Zain outlets, just as you would another shop, and receive their money. Of course, they were all closed. Did is instantly use the phone out in the field. And so we had people then going out with UNHCR into the field, verifying and delivering a bag of cash, I mean, basically giving cash out to people, but with zero change in the end-to-end validity of that cash payment. And, we started that at the beginning of COVID. We're still running it, actually. Interestingly, again, probably Jenny has more experience on this, but a lot of people wanted to stay at home. It's changed people's dynamics to a certain extent about how they travel, etc. So we're actually still seeing that continuing as a very big modality. So that has driven, and I would say the COVID in our experience, particularly on that, and I won't. We have several other examples, but we can cover those in later questions as well. It's actually increased more, I would say, digital inclusion than digital division. It's taken advantage of ecosystems that I think were already quite well developed. But it is the key point for us that we deal with emergencies, but we also deal with long-term support. But even in emergency situations, if you have established proper and I will use the phrase contractual relationships. It can be very time consuming to set up individual contracts with FSPs to that ecosystem. If you have it in place and it's fit for purpose and it fits for all of the other environments, then you can use it in these types of situations. And we've seen a 30% increase in the use of actually cash-based schemes coming through the system where people could hook into an existing point. So I think that's our key lesson as a company, that we have seen if you build it, you know, eventually people will come. They might not come in the way that you actually thought, but they can come in very useful down the line. So.
That's really interesting, Simon, and we're actually getting quite a few technical questions for you. So there's just one that I'm going to ask you right now, and then we're going to leave the rest for the Q&A session in a bit. But a really quick one, does IrisGuard have an API?
Yes, we do. So
and feel free to explain what an API is.
Yes, application programming interface. That basically means that we provide, and we have them for ATM, and I'm not just talking about an ATM of one particular bank. We have those that will hook in to the WinCore, again, to go slightly technical, the main software that runs all ATMs. Same in every one of the people who are on this screen and people who are participating. Doesn't matter where those ATMs are, there is standard software, because any FSP that has a license needs to conform to global international standards. And that's one very key point. Same with GSMA. There is one GSM standard. It's one of the key driving points. It's consistent. It doesn't matter whether you're in a very poor country with a very, very basic phone, or you're in California with the world's most expensive smartphone. The standard is the same across it. So all our APIs link in with EFTPOS devices. So those are within different points of sale where you'd be using your debit or credit card. We also have them for obviously back-end Windows systems as well, if you've got a PC or a fixed environment. We provide those to somebody. It's a very simple integration for somebody to come in on and bolt in. So they don't have to develop a new system, and then it's one common way of doing this. So again, a lot of people think there's different ways you have to learn different software, different systems. By providing standardized APIs, actually it's really easy to integrate, and you don't need a high degree of IT proficiency within your organization to be able to do that. It would be commonly what you would class as a normal IT support. Okay. Hope that answers that to
that was lovely, Simon.
Very good question. Sorry.
Excellent, Simon. And it really sheds light on the importance of it being user-friendly, but also adaptable and accessible. And with that, you've actually provided a great segue. And I turn to Barnaby right now. So the first year of the response was marked by a range of regulatory shifts in multiple countries that were intended to enable better uptake and access to digital payments. And GSMA has captured much of this in a tracker that you guys developed, and some of those regulatory shifts were made permanent quite early on. So is there any evidence of the longer term impacts of these shifts in countries that made them permanent?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And I mean, just interesting to reflect on some of the examples already we've heard from Jenny and from Simon. I'm sure others will also have examples of where mobile is playing a kind of all sorts of different roles, and it's, you know, it's a platform, it's been adapted, and I think we too, and our kind of mobile operator members have really seen that increase in demand for digital services and adapting them during the pandemic. And I guess the thing that is clear is that there's, you know, there was an immediate surge in demand that's died down, but the overall increased attention has continued. Just to sort of address your question specifically, I guess, I mean, the regulatory side is something we look at a lot. We work a lot with governments to really unlock the potential of different technologies. We saw a lot of change during the pandemic, which you reflected in your research. We also did some research, and I guess there was a sort of a wider reflection that the central role of government in responding to COVID, but also then in sort of ensuring that some of the innovations could actually be rolled out. It's a bit hard to say what the longer term impact is going to be. There's certainly been some policy shifts, some changes that governments have stuck with. And I think it's something that we're really keen to continue to monitor and do some research on. I think one of the sort of key things that was used that I think has persisted in some areas has been fee waivers, increasing the limits on transaction sizes and balances. That was one of the most commonly used regulatory measures. But I think there are some key lessons that I just want to reflect very quickly on the sort of sustainability of some of these responses, but also then on the kind of linking to the digital divide about kind of know your customer requirements that have come as a result of digitization. So I think with the cuts in, the changes in fee structures, a lot of the member operators actually did face a loss. And so I think there's a question of sustainability in terms of not just, companies make profits, they make losses, but I think there's a real challenge around the sustainability of the business model. And we really see this at the agent level, where in the early stages of the outbreak, a lot of mobile money users reported that agents didn't have liquidity, they weren't able to actually cash in or cash out, agents closed. So I think in terms of being able to access a consistent level of sort of service from agents to then support this, I think that's a really important thing to think about. How do we cope with crises? How do we look at interventions which can both enable people to access the services, but also do it in a sustainable way? I think the other point about government regulation is how the importance of having a digital identity system in place where that was in place before the pandemic made it much easier to deliver targeted support. So you didn't have such challenges of putting in place a new system for verifying people's identity. So I think in the research you talked about India and Thailand. So I think finding ways to verify identity is really important. And I think this goes to Simon's point about having the right sort of things in place beforehand. In the portfolio projects that we support, we saw a really interesting innovation that I think reflects some of what Jenny was talking about, which was Telesom in Somaliland was already looking at a biometric identification system. I don't think it wasn't an iris one, it was voice ID. And that's been really successful, and that pivoted during COVID so that they could actually deliver cash. This was with care, deliver cash without contact. And that's now being replicated. So I think this area of regulation, just to close, is really something that is crucial. It's something we work on a lot. And I think the longer term impact, I don't know, but we need to think about sustainability as a crucial part of this.
Thanks, Barnaby. And it's so interesting to hear about these different examples from around the world that kind of are all working towards the same thing in terms of how do we help those most in need, but how do we also sustain the way that we're helping in the long run? And there's a lot of conversation around the government will and engagement in these solutions moving forwards. Now, I do know that Give Directly worked with the Togolese government and other partners during the first year of the response on innovation on a large scale, including remote targeting mechanisms. So Alex, could you tell us a bit more about this, including your reflections on the key learning, both in terms of technology used and the different partnerships involved?
Sure, absolutely. So to start, I can provide a little bit of context about this program that Give Directly did in Togo in partnership with the government. The government of Togo launched a COVID response program really quickly, one of the fastest in the world. And they were providing cash transfers to people in the cities within about 10 days of the first lockdown. When the government decided they wanted to expand outside of cities and into rural areas, they invited Give Directly as well as some research partners at the University of California, Berkeley, to help them figure out how to best do that. So to do that, we partnered with the University of California, Berkeley, to apply a new technology that we call mobile aid. mobile aid technology uses big data and machine learning to identify, enroll, and pay people remotely. So the way that works is in a couple ways. The first is to identify the geographies that are most poor. And to do that, we took satellite imagery, processed it through a machine learning algorithm, and then could predict at the 2 square kilometer level the most poor regions in the country. And actually, we found that that was more predictive than other types of poverty rankings geographically, like the administrative data. The second is to figure out who within those geographies should be eligible. And to do that, we use mobile phone data, what we call CDR, or call detail record data, to predict the consumption levels of individual mobile phone subscribers. So that allowed us to look at the entire mobile phone subscriber base in Togo, figure out who lives in these geographies that we consider the most poor, the most vulnerable, and then pre-identify people as potentially eligible for the program. Then all those people had to do is enroll through their phone. They would just pull up a menu on their phone, type their name and their ID number. And if they had been pre-identified as eligible, they would be paid instantly, so within a minute or two. All in all, this paid about 140,000 people across the country. And we did an evaluation in partnership with Innovations for Poverty Action that actually found that this method was more inclusive and more precise than available alternative methods of targeting. So those alternative methods, what could they have been remotely? They could have been geographic targeting, either at the district level or at the regional level, or it could have been targeting using administrative data. So I think this program is really exciting. There's a lot of firsts for us at GiveDirectly, paying people instantly, what we call instant pay, paying people using this digital targeting method that uses big data and machine learning. And we had this big question of like, is this replicable? Is this something that we're only doing during an emergency, or can we take it elsewhere? What we found is that, yes, it is replicable. Most countries have some of the basic infrastructure needed for this. So that's cell phone data, that's some sort of digital payment infrastructure, whether it's mobile money or something else. And ideally some sort of ID system, although that's not necessarily required. But it is harder out of the emergency context. So far, we've been able to replicate this in the Congo in partnership with the World Bank and the government there. We did a program in Kinshasa that's reached about 50,000 people. And we're working now to expand this in Bangladesh, Nigeria, and Malawi. I think without that sense of urgency that the pandemic brought, it can be harder to get fee waivers. So the mobile money companies, the telcos might want to be paid for their work, which is perfectly fine. It's just a different model. And it can be harder to get people to move quickly. So this whole program was set up in a matter of weeks, and we're finding that it's taking months in alternative situations. It could be that other future crises create that sense of urgency, but ideally we'd be able to get this infrastructure set up ahead of the next crisis and think about how do we expand these type of programming for other types of crises like flooding in Bangladesh, Nigeria, other types of climate emergencies, or internal displacement. So I think that's what we're excited about now, is figuring out not just where can this model work, but in what types of contexts, and what else do we need to learn to make sure that we're expanding it well in these situations.
Thanks, Alex. It's really interesting. And I have 100 questions buzzing in my head for all of you. Just a quick question before we move on. Is this model replicable, and has it been used anywhere else?
Yes, so far it's been used in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It looks a little bit different in each place. So in the Congo, we were doing a geographic targeting where we tried to find the poorest neighborhood in Kinshasa and then enroll everybody in that neighborhood. Whereas in Togo, we were trying to find the poorest individuals across a broader region. So those are slightly different models, but they both use the same technical infrastructure.
Thanks, Alex. And I think just building on Alex's reflections on partnerships and targeting models, including the work with government. And this is a question open to all of our panelists. So how has the pandemic influenced partnerships between humanitarian organizations and other stakeholders from your experiences?
I'm happy to start there, just continuing on this theme. I think the pandemic really showed a lot of people what was possible. I think everybody was acting quickly and with such a state of urgency that new partnerships were formed that maybe wouldn't have been formed otherwise, and new ways of working together were formed. And I think some of that has really stuck. I think a lot of these partnerships are ongoing. I think a lot of the innovations we saw in the pandemic are continuing now. So I think that's been exciting learning for us. You know, we had more government partnerships during the pandemic than ever before, but that model's continued. So we're still doing all those government partnerships or new ones. It wasn't just a temporary pandemic change, but rather something that the pandemic catalyzed.
Thanks, Alex. Anyone else before we jump?
Oh, sorry.
We've got
Jenny,
Jenny and Simon.
Jenny, you go first. Go on, ladies.
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, just to add, maybe not quite government, but more on the kind of private sector partnerships with NGOs. I think this links a little bit back to what Alex and others have already mentioned about the importance of sort of investing in relationships pre-emergency. But just going back to that Gaza example I mentioned, I think the innovations we managed to achieve in the delivery process and that switch, you know, from like physical cards to codes was only really possible because we had a long-term positive relationship with Palpay, the financial service provider that we were working with in Palestine. And it was a lot of joint discussions and solutions being developed together that enabled, you know, Palpay to rapidly develop and deploy that technology and, you know, make sure that we could continue our operations. And I think we also included a few additional innovations in that partnership that helped increase transparency as we made that shift to remote programming. So, for example, we introduced like a automated SMS where beneficiaries would receive a receipt and their balance after every transaction, which sort of helped, you know, make sure there was transparency and more information sharing. So I think, you know, taking advantage of some of the longer relationships that you already have to innovate is also, you know, something that we learned as CRS at least.
Thanks, Jenny. That's really important to kind of capitalize on existing relationships, but also have the space to explore new opportunities and really engage everyone in a solution. Simon, over to you.
Well, I think Jenny keeps reading my notes. So I was actually going to say that to be very brutal, it has actually it's re-emphasized what a real partnership means, right? I mean, you know, the whole of this authentication business that we're now helping UNHCR in 6 countries, in Iraq and Egypt and Lebanon, Jordan, all of those countries came actually not from any contract that we specifically had. It was about looking at more ways that you can serve, more ways that you can be innovative. So, and that comes not from you pay me X for this or you do this or whatever. It comes from having a very honest and open discussion, particularly in tough, you know, Jenny knows it absolutely well, in very tough environments, and DRC and other areas are not easy countries to deal with. And that means you have to have very intertwined relationships between humanitarian sector, between financial providers, from government, from people like the World Bank and some of those big anchor UN operations as well. And so I think this has to a certain extent not redefined it, but made people think what real partnership actually means. And I think also that there isn't a them and us culture, you know, working together with very clear indications here about both private, both public, government and support organizations. You can work together very well on this. And I think that's the lesson we've learned as well. And, you know, there's deployments we've got sort of in like in East Timor, which, you know, is started during COVID as well. I would have to say as well, certain observations have been made throughout COVID that have pushed things. I mean, I could say, you know, iris because people didn't like to use fingerprints, and fingerprint readers have been used a lot in the humanitarian sector up to now. So it pushed an agenda in a different way. Face recognition, sometimes some issues with masks. So these are obvious things that pushed, but it also pushed people to look at how new innovation could come from quite challenging countries. East Timor is a very poor country, you know, one of the newest Southeast Asian countries, is looking about how does it support its citizens. So often innovation comes at times of stress, and I think the world has been stressed. And you know, I won't use that phrase, but war drives innovation. And I think COVID and the pandemic can be viewed as being a war, you know, that has pushed a lot of change away from what we were traditionally seeing. And as Alex said, has maybe accelerated sort of those developments that were hanging around in the side issue, but needed a push to get them there, with people thinking, oh, well, let's not do it on just a purely paid basis. Let's see if there's something that we can all do together that may come out as a winner at the end. So it's playing the longer game. Anyway, that's all I wanted.
Said that I think we've seen the partnerships that we develop between humanitarian agencies and mobile operators are really sort of, you know, they were there before, but I think there's exactly what Simon says. There's been examples of where people have been pushed into thinking differently, and actually it hasn't been a contractual relationship. It has been about, okay, how can we figure this out for our communities? You know, these are local private sector operators in their own countries, often trying to find solutions for their communities. So I think that sort of building a sort of a partnership which is more than contractual is something we've seen. I suppose the question is how long does this persist? And I absolutely see that the strong partnerships that have been built are being sustained. This picks up a little bit, I guess, what Alex was saying. It's like, how can we make this something that doesn't rely on an emergency? I mean, I think this is the point about pre-positioning. We need to be thinking about how do we get these sorts of relationships in place, not kind of forged during war or COVID, but actually this is how we need to be working. And certainly we've got examples, and we've documented some of them where that's the case. So yeah, I think that's a crucial takeaway.
That's amazing. And I'm actually going to build off of key things that you guys all mentioned, which is working together inclusively, engaging different stakeholders, but especially local communities and vulnerable groups. So I'm going to kind of shift and have a very honest and transparent conversation with you guys about digital divides. Now, we've heard a lot of things about how adaptations have allowed us to reach more people, to change the way that we work in a safe manner, considering the COVID restrictions. But I want to kind of unpack the whole gender and inclusion angle a bit more in terms of connectivity and access, be it availability or costs that families might have incurred or individuals, but also availability and access to the actual technology. You know, not everyone might have phones, and clearly there's a gender angle to everything that we're talking about over here. So, and this is a question for all of you. Where are we now in terms of the digital divide, and has the pandemic had an impact on this based on where you guys sit? And if so, could you share a few examples?
I'm happy to sort of jump in with a couple of thoughts, Chris. This is something that is really central to how we think, because, you know, the mobile industry makes a huge amount of money globally, but actually, when you look at the statistics in humanitarian contexts, the issues of the digital divide are enormous. And I think one of the challenges we saw, and we've heard of some of the examples, is where things have gone digital, then actually it's excluded people because they haven't, like I was saying, they haven't got the right ID, they haven't been able to kind of register accounts. So what we've really focused on, and what we want to do more on, is really understanding what are some of these barriers, both to coverage. I mean, how do you even just get a network to some of the places that we're working, but then also people being able to use the technology to access all of these important tools. We're just piloting a really interesting assessment tool called Conua, the Connectivity Needs and Usage Assessment Tool, and that is really to try and help agencies understand, well, where can you actually get different types of connectivity in humanitarian context? What are some of the barriers? And we're doing a lot of research in a number of contexts, but at the moment, particularly Lebanon, Papua New Guinea, and South Sudan, to understand how do people use their phones in a very sort of rich way. And I think this is the point. The way I use my phone is very different from the way, you know, someone even in, you know, another country in Europe uses it, let alone if you're looking at someone in displacement in the Ukraine region or further afield. So understanding the sort of contextual barriers to accessing using mobile technology is really important. And you touched on things like the cost of handsets. We need to look at how do you actually make it easier to access handsets through different models, airtime, literacy and digital skills, really basic infrastructure stuff like, you know, actually can you get network coverage? So much of the system that we're talking about when we're talking about, you know, digital cash transfers relies on this sort of connectivity. Not always, but often. And I think the reliability is something we need to understand better, and how that then hinders, you know, businesses using these more sophisticated tools. What can we do with lower technology, you know, basic phones? So many opportunities out there, charging electricity, so many things that I think are actually, you know, the problems have been solved. We just need to adapt the solutions to humanitarian contexts, and then think about what really a sort of a digitally inclusive humanitarian action looks like. What can we do about that? So I think it's about understanding the gaps. It's about doing more research, more kind of data gathering, but then applying a lot of the solutions that already exist, and seeing how we can apply them in humanitarian contexts.
Thanks, Barnaby. That's really interesting, and I definitely loved your point on existing solutions that can be adapted within the humanitarian sector. Alex, I saw that you unmuted.
Sure, I'd love to add to this, and thank you for bringing this up. I think the way we think about the digital divide is in a couple of ways. I think first is proactively, and how can we address it from the start? So one thing we do is try to address it in program design. So for example, in our program in Togo, we had larger transfer sizes for women than we did for men, which helped create an incentive for households that only had one phone for the female in the house to enroll. And that turned out to work. We had about 55% of enrollees as women in that program. The second thing we're trying to do is to address it through technical partnerships. So through some of our private sector partnerships, like with the telcos, we're creating programs that actually would have SIM card registrations and mobile phone distributions ahead of the program. So for example, in Nigeria, we're trying to design a flood response. And before we do that flood response, we're planning on going in with the telcos, making sure that everybody in the targeted region has access to a phone and has access to a SIM card. And then they'll be prepared to enroll in the program when the time comes. This is not a flawless idea. We have to see if people, actually retain their SIM cards, if they trade them, et cetera. But it's something that we're looking at doing proactively. The last thing we do is have some sort of redress mechanism. So we're not going to be able to solve the digital divide in any single program. We want to make sure that these programs are not excluding people. So increasingly what we're trying to do is hybrid programs, where we would call them perhaps digital first, with a in-person redress mechanism to make sure that those people that do not have phones or could not enroll for whatever reason aren't left behind. And what that means is we might have a place where 85% of people have phones. Those 85% of people enroll. And then we can spend our field resources just finding those 15% of people, going door to door and doing traditional programs to get them enrolled. So I think, we're working toward a future where everything is digital end to end and everyone is able to enroll and participate in programs digitally, remotely, and without any sort of in-person interaction. But we're not there yet. And I think until we get there, these types of hybrid programs can be really important for both making sure that we're investing in accelerating this technology, but also making sure that people who are not there yet are not left out.
Thanks, Alex. Ensuring that no one's left behind is definitely something that we all work towards. Simon, I noticed that you unmuted. I just want to check if you would like to add.
Yeah, I maybe I can, because obviously we're, we started really a lot of this business with the Syrian crisis, which up until obviously Ukraine was the single largest sort of humanitarian crisis in one era. There are several mechanisms that have already been implemented in that over the years as well. One, as Alex has just pointed out, is actually providing SIM cards already, SIMs to, that are already been pre-registered as well. We have in our the database of the millions we're dealing with, over 75% of refugees have some form of phone, right? Some form of mobile device, which actually is sometimes higher than in some other country, the metrics. But they're not the latest smartphones, absolutely. They can often be, low end, although pricing structure, of course, varies hugely in different parts of the world as well. And that enters another debate about subsidizing. I've been through the 1G when, it was a huge amount of subsidy, and then the subsidies got less and people wanted to buy the devices. There's been very big shifts in the business model. So it is possible to shift business models one way or the other between a variety of costs on handset. That's one point. The second point is design things, particularly within the digital, that actually isn't for the best device possible. Design it for the lowest possible common denominator that you can within reason. So all our systems can provide initially an anchor verification, and I'll come back just to that point, from the registered iris, with a very small package. For then doing verification, it's 1K, less than 1K. It's a very small amount. So you can operate the system on a 2G. Now, again, Barnaby knows this very well. Lots of countries are switching off the 2G network as well. So they're actually going the opposite way, which is let's get bigger and better. I'm actually addressing you here on Starlink, right? Elon Musk's system. So I'm one of the beta testers for satellite communications. Now, technically, within less than 5 years, every square meter of the Earth's surface could be covered with satellite communication, right? So, which would provide connectivity. Now, obviously, that is not going to be available to everybody in a pricing structure that is based on, let's say, Western European pricing. However, if we go back to the Humanitarian and what is possible, it is highly possible if the commercial environment or that giving and governmental support operation decides that they would provide access to satellite for the humanitarian sector. It could revolutionize some of the reporting and infrastructure that is there. So again, often you can leapfrog technologies, and we've seen this in many areas where driving that. So what I would say is that having some form of initial digital identity, and that identity is linked into a digital system, but then having the usage of it being capable of being not at the highest level, but at a variety of different optional levels, like Alex mentioned, I think is the way to go. We're looking, Jenny talked about QR codes. We're developing a QR code linked to the iris. So you've got that 100% verification back to a proper system, but you could just read it on a very simple phone, just keep it as a photo as well, which then doesn't mean you have to have a complex infrastructure for the services that are related to it. So I think it's about, what services do you need relevant to what technology? That's my point.
Thanks, Simon, and thank you all. Excellent points. Now, I want to shift the conversation a bit. Well, not too much, quite relevant, and we've been touching upon it as we went through this conversation, which is data responsibility and data management. And we also have a few questions that have been popping up in the Q&A around this, in terms of, we're using more digital platforms, everything's online, and basically this has really triggered a lot of questions around data responsibility and data risks, especially as the partnerships look different, as people start to access their aid in different ways. So while the pandemic itself may or may not have notably influenced approaches to data responsibility and data risks the last 2 years, what would you draw out as key experiences and learning from this period? And is there any evidence of how this is influencing programming now?
This is the world's toughest question and the hottest topic, I know. So I know everyone's sitting there going,
I never said I was going to make it easy, guys.
I don't want to answer this.
It's very important, and there's a lot of interest.
Absolutely, and people are right to be so as well. And actually, although it might sound slight trait, I mean, we manage all of our systems, and I told you about those figures earlier on, with anonymity, right? So yes, we have an anchored identity, but that is never passed through third parties. So there is a trusted owner of that data, which is not us as a company, right? So, that it's about who do you trust for that ultimate point. We have 43 CCF members as a common cash facility, as NGOs under the UNHCR banner. Who do they trust? They trust the data that's stored with UNHCR, and that's in Geneva, right? So, in many respects, and I would argue this, in many respects, on certain categories within the humanitarian sector, the control and management of data is at a higher standard and a higher level than we ourselves as individuals are actually part and parcel to within the Western world. We have multiple identities. We sign up to this and that. We give all sorts of different things. For particular anchored services, then these are the bodies. But it is about consent, right? It's about also consent. Are you forcing that? Are you giving options? Are you designing a system that allows actually options? We have a system in our own system, which is worked out with the UNHCR about some alternate collectors, right? Somebody else who can go out on your behalf, or etc. You have practices and processes as part of that are inside your system. Now, I would argue quite strongly, actually, that the more we're going towards digital, actually, in a lot of instances, the more we are actually getting into much more efficient systems, and efficient being also that the right person receives that the wrong person isn't receiving something that they shouldn't, or is actually taking it from somebody else when we have limited resources. And we all know the issues of early days of somebody going out on a piece of paper or just giving aid without any form of linkage at all. We live in the real world now. It's a tough environment that the economy of many countries is going through. And some form of accountability also provides efficiencies, and those efficiencies mean that there's more money available to support more people. And I won't go into the figures, but we've done lots of stuff on fraud analysis in the Middle East on the Syrian crisis, and it comes to billions of dollars with millions of people. So it is really about how do you design systems that actually have at their core a very trusted body and organization. And then who do you allow access to, not the data, but the services? And there are many good examples, particularly under the UNHCR banner, where many people can access provide services, but without actually accessing to data. All of our FSPs that we deal with huge sums of money through on behalf of people who are paid by organizations like Jenny and others as well, with zero information about the person who is actually receiving that. Absolute complete. They don't need an identity document. They can actually just present themselves, say nothing, receive their aid. So I think there are good examples where you can design systems that do this. So I think that's my main comment on this at the moment. And it's all about information, consent as well, and informed consent and choices. So,
thanks, Simon.
Yeah. I took the bullet first. So.
Thank you very much. I'm actually going to share a few thoughts that Anna had shared with us. Again, unfortunately, she couldn't join us due to the connectivity issues. But some of her thoughts include that data responsibility considerations are now no longer an afterthought and do feature in the early stages of the program design. Most observable in the Ukraine response so far, as early as 8th March data information sensitivity classification to inform the responsible sharing of operational data in this response. Data protection has also been a key consideration for task teams on delivery mechanisms, targeting, and deduplication developed under the Ukraine Cash Working Group. And in terms of food for thought and what we as CVA practitioners should pay attention to next, it was instructive that the French Data Protection Authority has just recently published a white paper on today's and tomorrow's payment data facing the challenge of data protection. The paper is designed to promote public debate and influence future policy. Some of the key messages that she would like to share with us on the future policy highlights and would no doubt have a bearing on us as humanitarian CVA implementers. First, the preservation of the anonymity of payments by the use of cash and the free choice of means of payments. Second, the importance of protecting the privacy of transactions by design from the outset in the ongoing Digital Euro project launched by the European Central Bank in July 2021. And the third being the interest for innovative players to make their compliance with GDPR a factor of trust for customers who are led to entrust their data for new uses. And a lot of these points you guys have touched upon throughout our conversation. So those are just a few thoughts that Anna had shared with us. Does anyone want to add anything else regarding data responsibility or data management?
I think Anna made a good summary of those three main issues. Actually, I have no disagreement with her at all. I think design it early, look at legislation that's surrounding, that's relevant. We're a GDPR compliant company. I mean, we conform to ISO standards, lots of financial standards, mobile standards, none of which a lot of which don't necessarily have to apply in the countries that we operate in, but because we are that type of organization, that's what we basically hold ourselves accountable to as well. And I think that's the right thing. Do it at the highest level. Don't dumb down to what is possible for cutting corners or is fit for purpose. I come back to my work in the GSM. Why is GSM so successful, right? Because it built one standard that applies to the highest level in any country, no matter what device you do. And that is a huge, huge statement that everyone should be. Do not build it to the lowest common denominator, build it to the highest possible. Comment?
Thank you, Simon, and thank you all. I want to wrap up with a final question before we head to the Q&A part of our conversation today. There's so many takeaways, so much food for thought. But if I can ask each panelist to kind of shed light on one or two key takeaways or examples of best practices or learning, what would they be? I'm going to start with Jenny.
Thanks, Chris. Super interesting discussions. I guess one of my key takeaways is that the pandemic kind of gave us additional momentum to speed up our adoption of digital technologies, seek more efficient ways of working. So I don't think any of that was kind of new because of COVID, but it definitely kind of forced us to, speed up the process. Particularly for delivery of assistance, which is what we've mainly been talking about, but also for how we communicate with, participants and the people that we're working with. So we've seen many adaptations, particularly in the use of social media, mobile phones for communicating program information. But I think we still need to be really mindful that these solutions are not appropriate for every context and not for every person. And one area that I definitely found we could improve as I was talking to teams to kind of hear some of their learning to share today was that we didn't really have a lot of monitoring of the effectiveness of these new communication channels and tools that we used. So it links a little bit to the digital divide discussion, but I think we can definitely be better at kind of learning what's working and what's not. And then I guess another key takeaway is that when we're considering this shift to remote programming is to make sure we ensure we have like smart monitoring systems in place, functional feedback mechanisms like Alex mentioned, that are accessible, as well as additional information sharing with participants to prevent any kind of misconduct by vendors, such as that example I mentioned in Gaza about, sharing automatically like remaining balances and transaction receipts with people so that they're more in control and kind of can report issues to agencies. So I'd say learning and using this learning to improve our communication channels with participants, as well as finding innovative ways to sort of strengthen our controls and accountability when we're doing remote programming has been really important.
Thank you, Jenny. Barnaby, over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, there's a few things that have really resonated. I think in the discussion we had on the digital divide, I think this point about hybrid programs, that's something that really resonates with our experience about, let's do digital, but let's think about who that can't reach and put resources that we need to into that sort of side of it. So it's hybrid. I think the point that Simon made about shifting business models, partly as a way to kind of, address things like affordability of airtime and handsets. But I think this idea of just thinking about it as a sort of business model is really important. Pre-positioning relationships, I think we've all talked about that. And I think that's where trying to get out of an emergency mindset and think about sort of preparedness and pre-positioning, that sort of relates a little bit to sort of final point about the kind of, having an open system. So give people SIMs, but make sure it's not just to allow them to access, one cash transfer from one agency, but allow that to be a platform for them to, participate in the Give Directly sort of Nigeria flood program, anticipatory action, think about financial inclusion. How can this then, we're looking at how do you digitize savings groups to access sort of a wider set of products, social protection. I think just sort of thinking about it holistically and seeing how digital can be a platform to wider things, but absolutely thinking about data responsibility. Thanks.
Thank you, Barnaby. Simon, over to you.
Oh, sure. Good segue. Yeah, I think we've all mentioned this partnership. Yeah, I mean, 100%. You have to have that built in right at the start. I would say that it is multimodality as well. I mean, this to use a phrase, it's often used in terms of cash delivery or CVA as well. You need to have multimodality, and I think that's been reflected very much through COVID as well. Being able to swap from one to another quickly without being forced under one route that you basically do. So I think multimodality is very, very important. I think that we're seeing that mobile is having it's had a huge part to play, but that it has to again reflect, as Barnaby said, it has to reflect a wide number of usages in a wide different way that it can be used. And I think we're seeing the opportunity for it to be used in some really innovative ways that does address quite a lot of the needs on the ground as well. Reporting, Jenny mentioned this as well, absolutely, that utilize the systems sometimes that are already in place. We deal with, there's different portals that you can put in place for monitoring how monies go through the systems, often that they're already being pre-designed by FSPs as well. You can hook into those and stuff without having to, inverted commas, reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of opportunities for that. So I think not reinventing the wheel is a good one as well. So I think those are the key lessons that we've seen, and possibly also that speed, things can be done speedily as well. Things can be done speedily. Unfortunately, when things are sort of going along as normal and the world is all in a nice, compliant and complacent place, that we do tend to be we tend to lose that innovative edge. We tend to lose that point to actually really push things forward. And I think, going back to my point, COVID has driven another slightly warlike situation that has pushed innovation. And I'm fully convinced that there will be some great things that come out of this that do move things forward.
Thanks, Simon. Alex, over to you.
Awesome. Well, definitely agree with all of these takeaways so far. I think one thing I would add is I think there's a large need for more research. And I would add that we want to come at that from a couple of different directions. I think one is to do more rigorous evaluations that can show us the inclusion and exclusion errors of different types of approaches and really document that in different communities and different settings. I mentioned the evaluation we did in Togo, but one thing we're trying to do now is a comparison of this hybrid approach we've been discussing with a traditional approach that just does field-based proxy means test enrollment. And compares that to different levels of geographic targeting. I think doing these head-to-head tests is really important because otherwise we can be relying on a lot of assumptions. So looking at not just inclusion and exclusion, but also cost effectiveness. I think that research sometimes, as you all know, can take a while, but important to get it started and to figure out how we can do it as quickly as possible. I think the second type of research is really program design research. So really looking at what we call human-centered design. So actually starting with the program beneficiaries, understanding how do they interact with this technology already, and how can we tailor programs to create the best experiences for them. I think it can be hard to do that when you feel like you're in a crisis and you need to act fast. So I think one is when we're not in that crisis mode and we have a little more time to make sure to really heavily invest in it. And then to also find ways that we can make sure that these principles of human-centered design are included even in crisis settings.
Thank you, Alex. I'm just mindful about the time. We have 12 minutes to go and we have a few interesting questions, but unfortunately we won't be able to get to all of them. So I'm just going to ask one or two questions. And if we could keep the answers a bit brief before we wrap up and close for the day. So the first question, pretty general one, and this is a bit to everyone. Everything sounds very positive, but what didn't work and what should be avoided in the future?
I mean, I suppose this is sort of the implication is I mean, I think it's absolutely right that, I mean, we are presenting solutions, but I think the discussion that we had on the digital divide shows that we've got to think about, you know, who's not able to access this. And I really want to go back to Simon's point about it's not all about the shiny smartphones. I think, you know, it's not even about mobile phones full stop in some places. You know, really interesting research we're doing in Papua New Guinea, where, you know, mobile phone penetration in displaced Papuan communities is tiny, and people, you know, either don't have a handset, don't know how to use it. So we have to think about the situations, but also then what are the opportunities to address that. So I think it is about, yeah, really understanding the kind of inclusion challenge. And I think Alex's point about that research side of it is so important. So I'm not sure I've answered the question, but I think that is the key to this. It's not just about the technology, it's understanding the limits of it.
Any other insights before I jump to the next question?
Don't rely on put all your eggs in one basket. I mean, that is one very clear lesson, that have not even multiple, but have more than one choice, right, available to you in this situation. And there are certain circumstances where, from contractual reasons, for other things, we have been, and we're not alone in this, you've been in one thin thread, and that thread, you know, when this happens, gets broken or disrupted. And that's a very clear lesson from us. Actually, even wasn't even brought in with COVID. We had issues in Lebanon when there was the issue with the explosion and stuff like that. That if you have just one route, that can make you very vulnerable to supplying in this in this environment that we are talking about. That's my comment.
Amazing. I think just one last question, and then we're going to wrap up. How can the private sector, and in particular fintechs, provide assurance to humanitarian actors and build the right foundation for long-term relationships and partnerships? Really tricky questions coming in.
Oh, go on, I'll answer that one. The main thing is how can fintechs, private sector build those relationships? I think one thing I would say is you have to look a little bit, particularly in the humanitarian sector. So fintech is a nice phrase that we all throw about and covers everything from the wonders in California and America and London of these amazing different systems with cryptocurrencies and different technologies. But actually, I think in the context of what we're happening about, it's about very, very traditional financial service providers being encouraged to be sensible part of what can be a very, very challenging ecosystem to get involved in. People say, why don't, on these sort of calls and stuff, why don't we have more private sector, get more private sector engagement? The very fact that we are talking about that as an item tells you that there's slightly an imbalance in this as well. And one of the reasons of that imbalance is because, with massive due respect to people who are listening or whatever, it is very difficult to actually enter into those types of relationships where you have to sort of put aside some of the normalities of SLAs and other things, and you have to look at what the objective is. What are we trying to achieve? And we've got some great examples, which I won't go into now, about dealing with banks, very traditional banking organizations, but having to sort of park them. You've heard the phrase neobanks. A lot of people are talking about the traditional banking sector, but separated off for this new business area that is slightly different. So I think the real challenge in the fintech world, or in this particular round, is to actually focus on what the key objective is. And I won't share some of those stuff, but we often have some very brutal conversations with banking organizations when you're talking to them about, wouldn't it be great? Couldn't you support inside this country? Couldn't you do this? Couldn't you do that? And they turn around and say, well, how much money is going to go through the system? And how long is it going to take me to negotiate 4 or 5 different contracts over that period of time for that money? So it's a bit of brutal reality sometimes about this. So that's sort of really what I feel quite strongly about this, that you have to build slightly different relationships in order to achieve the objective actually that isn't far ahead. A financial service provider in a fintech world wants to put money and transactions through its system. That's a fact, right? The GSM operator wants to put volume through its system somewhere down the line. So how do you put an environment together that actually is a win-win for both situations? So I think take away the traditional and look at some innovative ways that you can work together, and then you'll drive the agenda forward.
Thanks a lot, Simon, and thank you all. I think the pandemic has really re-emphasized what partnership actually needs to be, to have honest and open discussions and moving away from the them versus us culture, and to move beyond transactional relationships and actually build genuine connections with different stakeholders, to push each other to think differently and innovate and find solutions for their own communities. You also touched upon, having human-centered design, really starting with recipients and what's available in their environments and building up from that, which looks at, genuinely researching and evaluating targeting and looking at inclusion and exclusion errors and see what works where, looking at hybrid programs, potentially digital and non-digital, to allow greater inclusion and transition. Also to look at the monitoring side, have smart monitoring in place and additional communication with recipients throughout programming, be it remote or not when we're not also operating in remote operations. But to genuinely just move forward towards empowering communities and the most vulnerable, but all the stakeholders as well, in terms of being able to enforce accountability in different settings and different spaces. So, I mean, these are my key takeaways from today, and there's so much more, and I'm sure we could go on for another couple of hours as we unpack each point separately. And but unfortunately, our time is almost up. So I just want to again thank all of the panelists for all of your time and your effort and your expertise, but also the amazing engagement from everyone that has been with us today during the webinar. And thank you for your active contributions. I think I just want to wrap up with reminding everyone that this is 1 out of 3 webinar series. Rose, if we could just put up the, thank you very much. So we have 2 more webinars coming up. Please join us with additional excellent panelists that will be engaging with us on the 17th of May. We're going to be covering linkages with social protection systems. And on the 14th of June, we're looking at localization. More details will be shared soon on the website and different platforms in terms of the link to register, more details on time and who will be joining us. So just to wrap up right on time, again, big thank you to everyone. Thank you, Barnaby, Jenny, Simon, Alex, and thank you to my team who has made all of this possible. And yeah, so have a lovely day ahead. Great to chat with all of you and take care.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks for chairing so well.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.